It was the year 54 AD, and Rome was the beating heart of the known world, a city of 1 million souls, merchants and slaves, senators and beggars, all moving under the watchful gaze of the imperial palaces that crowned the Palatine Hill. It was a place where fortunes could be made overnight or lost in an afternoon, a place where whispers could kill as surely as the sword. At the center of it all was a boy. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was just 16 when the purple cloak of the Caesars was draped across his shoulders. By adoption, he became Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Emperor of Rome. He was tall for his age, with the fair hair of his family line and eyes that burned with restless energy. His smile could be warm, almost boyish, yet when the court jesters saw it, they whispered among themselves, "That smile hides storms." Rome loved its new ruler in those first days. After the iron grip of his great-uncle Claudius, the people welcomed the fresh-faced boy who waved from the balcony and tossed coins to the crowd. To them, he was the golden dawn after years of cloudy skies. But power in Rome was never simply given. It was taken, and it had to be kept. Behind the colonnades of the Senate, behind the clatter of the Forum, gears were already turning. Advisors and generals, slaves and scribes, everyone had their place in the great machine that kept Rome alive. There was the Senate, ancient and proud, still pretending to hold sway over the emperor's decisions. The Praetorian Guard, an elite wall of steel around the throne, loyal only as long as the pay was good. And the people, the million citizens who filled the markets, theaters, and circuses, who could crown a man in one breath and tear him down in the next. For now, these factions aligned behind Nero. He was the charming boy emperor who promised to rule with justice and mercy. But mercy was a word easily bent, and justice, in Rome, often wore the mask of revenge. Let us step into that Rome for a moment, the Rome of Nero's first years. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat from street vendors. Fishmongers shout their wares near the Tiber, where barges unload goods from Egypt, Gaul, and beyond. Children dart between market stalls, playing games with nuts and stones. Senators in white togas glide past, flanked by slaves who carry scrolls and wax tablets. The city hums with life, and beneath that hum, with danger. For every marble temple and perfumed garden, there is an alley where shadows gather, where thieves and informers trade secrets for coin. In Rome, even a whisper could be worth a man's life. It was into this world that she walked Poppaea Sabina. Daughter of a noble family, she carried herself like someone who had been born knowing that the world would yield to her beauty. Her hair was the color of late summer wheat, her skin pale as polished ivory. Men noticed her, women envied her, and Poppaea knew it. She had a way of entering a room that made every conversation falter, every head turn. Some said it was her perfume, imported from the East at staggering cost. Others said it was her voice, low and smooth, a voice that could caress or cut depending on her mood. When Nero first saw her, she was already married to Otho, one of his closest companions. That detail only seemed to sharpen the young emperor's interest. The first meeting between Nero and Poppaea was, according to those who served at court, charged with something unspoken. She bowed with the perfect depth for an empress-to-be, her eyes lifting just enough to catch his. The look lingered too long for mere politeness. Otho smiled, oblivious. Or perhaps not. For in Rome, even friendship was a political calculation. Soon, invitations to private banquets began to appear. Poppaea was seen at the theater, always in the imperial box. Rumors bloomed like flowers in the hot summer air. In these early years, Nero still played the role of the virtuous ruler. He lowered taxes, ended certain trials for treason, and appeared often among the people. Musicians and poets were invited to the palace. The emperor himself played the lyre at feasts. But behind the wine and music, something was shifting. Nero's love for art and performance was not the passing fancy of a young man, it was an obsession. He spoke openly of his desire to act on stage, to compete in public games. To Rome's elite, this was scandalous. Emperors were not entertainers. But to Nero, the line between ruler and artist was already fading. And when it came to love art, and reality would blur even more dangerously. In the quiet corners of the palace, where torchlight flickered on frescoed walls, Nero and Poppaea met. Servants whispered of late-night walks in the gardens, of laughter that turned to hushed tones, of silences that felt like decisions being made. The boy emperor who had once been a symbol of hope was beginning to disappear. History tells us that the reign of Nero would be marked by fire, not only the flames that would one day consume the city, but the slow, consuming fire of his own desires. And in that fire, a woman's beauty, a man's pride, and an empire's fate would be forged together. The Golden Boy Emperor had begun his journey, and Rome was holding its breath. Nero's passion for Poppaea Sabina was a fire that burned hot enough to consume anything in its path: duty, family, even the stability of Rome itself. In the months following their marriage, their life together seemed, to the casual observer, dazzling. Poppaea walked through the marble halls of the Palatine Hill like she had been born to rule. Draped in silks the color of pomegranate wine, her hair bound with gold threads that glimmered in torchlight, she was the embodiment of Roman luxury. Wherever she went, the air seemed to thicken with the perfume of Arabian myrrh, and people from senators to the lowest kitchen slave could not help but turn their heads. For Nero, Poppaea was more than a wife. She was an ideal, a living canvas upon which he could paint his fantasies of imperial glory. Yet beneath the outward splendor, there was a tension, a constant hum of unease that rippled through the palace walls. Nero's first wife, Claudia Octavia, was still alive. She had been banished to the island of Pandateria, a rocky, wind-lashed place in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Octavia's exile had been a scandal. She was the daughter of the revered Emperor Claudius and the beloved sister of Britannicus, both now dead. To many Romans, she represented legitimacy, stability, and the old order. The people loved Octavia fiercely, and her removal had sparked riots in the streets. Women had marched to the Forum crying out for her return. Statues of Poppaea had been pulled down and smashed. Nero had silenced the unrest with brutality, soldiers pouring into the streets, arresting leaders of the protests, and executing those who resisted. Still, the resentment simmered. This was the shadow that Poppaea lived under. No matter how many jewels Nero draped around her neck, no matter how many banquets she hosted, she knew there were whispers that she had stolen her crown, that she was a usurper, that she had seduced the emperor into discarding the rightful empress, and those whispers had teeth. In the imperial court, loyalty was a performance, and everyone knew their role. Senators bowed low, their togas sweeping the marble, their smiles perfectly rehearsed. Courtiers praised Nero's poetry, his singing, his ability to drive a chariot, all with the same false enthusiasm, but behind closed doors, the palace was a nest of vipers. Every slave, every secretary, every freedman had their own web of alliances. News traveled fast, faster than the flicker of an oil lamp in a draft. Poppaea's enemies were patient. They knew her beauty and wit had ensnared Nero, but they also knew his love was as volatile as summer lightning. All they needed was for that lightning to strike the wrong place. It was in the summer of 65 AD that the storm finally gathered. Rome sweltered under a heat that made tempers short and sleep restless. The Tiber ran low, the air hung heavy with the scent of stagnant water and rotting reeds. Even the marble statues seemed to sweat. Poppaea was in the later months of pregnancy, and every step was an effort. Her ankles were swollen, and she spent long hours reclining on couches in the shaded gardens of the palace. Servants fanned her with peacock feathers, while musicians played softly in the background. Nero visited often in those days, but he was not at ease. The empire was restless. There had been another plot against his life, the Pisonian conspiracy, and its aftermath had drenched Rome in blood. Senators, equestrians, and even poets had been forced to open their veins in front of their families, accused of treason. Nero's paranoia was now a constant companion. It was in this climate of tension and fear that the fateful quarrel occurred. It began with words, as so many tragedies do. Poppaea, frustrated and exhausted, had criticized Nero's decision to leave Rome for a chariot race in Neapolis. She reminded him that his presence was needed in the capital, that the people murmured about his neglect of state affairs. Her voice, though not loud, carried an edge that cut through the air. Nero, already on edge from political troubles, took her words as an insult not to his governance, but to his pride. He paced the room, his voice rising, accusing her of ingratitude, of meddling in affairs that were his alone to decide. Poppaea, never one to back down, retorted with sharpness. She spoke of Octavia not by name, but in allusion, reminding him of the scandal that had followed her banishment. She warned that the people's love was fickle, that the Senate's loyalty was bought with fear and could be lost just as quickly. Each word she spoke seemed to fan the flames in Nero's mind. His face flushed, his breathing quickened. The tension between them, built up over months, years even, snapped like a bowstring. In a sudden, furious gesture, Nero struck her. Accounts differ as to the exact nature of the blow. Some say it was a kick, others a violent shove, but all agree on its consequence. Poppaea fell, and with that fall, her unborn child's fate was sealed. The room went still. The musicians had stopped playing. The servants stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the floor. Nero's own breath came in ragged gasps as the enormity of what had happened began to sink in. He called for physicians, shouting orders, demanding they save her. But Roman medicine, even in the imperial palace, could do little for such an injury. By nightfall, Poppaea was dead. The news spread with the speed of fire through dry grass. In the taverns of the Subura, men drank in silence, unsure whether to curse or mourn. In the forum, citizens whispered beneath the porticos, careful not to be overheard by the wrong ears. Officially, it was announced that Poppaea had died of an illness, a convenient lie that fooled no one. The Senate dutifully decreed honors, statues, and a state funeral. But in private, many saw the emperor for what he was, a man who had murdered his own wife and unborn child in a fit of temper. Yet, if Nero felt any shame, it was buried beneath an overwhelming tide of grief. He refused to have Poppaea's body burned in the traditional Roman manner. Instead, he ordered her embalmed, her body preserved with the most expensive spices and unguents imported from Arabia. She was placed in a sarcophagus of alabaster, her face painted to look as though she slept. For weeks, Nero could not bear to be apart from her remains. He would sit beside the sarcophagus, speaking to her as though she were still alive, recounting the events of the day, seeking her opinion on matters of art, politics, and the theater. At night, the palace corridors echoed with the sound of his weeping. Musicians played soft laments in the courtyard below, their melodies drifting up into the darkness. It was in those sleepless nights that the seed of an idea took root in Nero, as mind an idea that would lead to one of the most macabre episodes in Roman history. If Poppaea could not return to him, perhaps she could be replaced. He began to notice one of his young attendants, a boy named Sporus. The resemblance was faint, more in manner than in feature, but it was enough to spark Nero's imagination. He began speaking to Sporus more often, watching him with an intensity that made the boy uneasy. Nero's grief had curdled into something darker, an obsession with recreating what he had lost, and soon the entire imperial court would be forced to witness and participate in the emperor's descent into a living nightmare. The death of Poppaea Sabina struck the Roman court like a sudden eclipse, plunging every chamber of the Palatine into an eerie twilight. No one dared speak of the truth that the empress had died beneath the hand of her husband, at least not aloud. Whispers lived only behind closed doors, muffled in darkened corridors, and even then, one's own shadow might betray them. For Nero, her death was not an ending, it was a transformation. The moment the midwives fled the marble floor, their sandals slipping in the crimson pool left behind, he seemed to vanish into another realm of reality entirely. Some claimed that the emperor did not truly believe she was gone. Others said he knew it too well, and the knowledge had fractured something deep inside his mind. Roman custom dictated that the dead be honored with ceremony, cremation, processions, eulogies. But Poppaea's body never saw the pyre. Instead, Nero ordered her embalmed in the Egyptian style, an extravagant act that shocked the priesthood. The embalming took place in a private chamber, guarded day and night by the Praetorian Guard. Foreign specialists from Alexandria were brought in, bearing alabaster jars of perfumed oils and resins. They worked in silence as the emperor watched from a gilded chair, his face unreadable, his fingers tapping the lion head armrest in a slow, obsessive rhythm. He would not allow her to decay. He demanded that she be made eternal. The air inside the embalming chamber was heavy with the scent of myrrh, frankincense, and crushed lotus flowers. Linen strips rustled as they wrapped her, layer after layer, turning her once-living form into something at once sacred and unsettling. When it was done, she was placed in a crystal casket and moved to the imperial apartments, where she would remain as a silent, ever-present queen. Life inside the palace changed overnight. Nero ordered the torches dimmed, the curtains drawn, and the musicians to play only soft, melancholy tunes. Every banquet, every gathering took place in this twilight world where laughter was forced and joy forbidden unless it was about her memory. He began speaking to her casket as though she might respond. In the mornings, he would greet her with the same courtly words he had once used when she was alive. At night, he dined beside her, the dishes laid out as though for two. Even the servants had to pretend she was present, offering her food, bowing as they passed. It was a grotesque form of theater, and everyone was an unwilling actor. To falter in the performance was dangerous. One musician who failed to play with enough emotion was beaten for disrespecting the empress. Another servant, who stumbled and dropped a dish in her presence, was exiled to a remote outpost in Armenia. Outside the palace walls, Rome whispered. The common people remembered Nero's earlier charm, how he had lowered taxes, given games, and paraded through the streets singing with them. But now their emperor had retreated into a private shadow, appearing rarely, and when he did, it was in long black robes, his face painted white with grief. Market stalls in the Subura sold miniature figurines of Poppaea in crystal coffins, while in the taverns, muttered jokes spread about the empress who dines without eating. But these jokes were dangerous. Spies and informers moved through the streets like hunting dogs. The Senate, ever cautious, passed resolutions praising Nero's unparalleled devotion to his late wife. They compared him to mythic lovers who defied death Orpheus, Admetus, even Jupiter himself. The flattery kept them alive. It was in these months of mourning that Nero's obsession took on its most disturbing form. He began searching for ways to bring her back, not literally, but in essence. Artists were commissioned to paint hundreds of portraits of Poppaea, each slightly different. Statues of her, carved from ivory and marble, filled the palace gardens. Poets were forced to write new verses each day in her honor, so that her name was spoken endlessly within the palace walls. And then, late one night, came the moment that would alter the course of another life entirely. Sporus was a young page in the imperial household, known for his soft features and delicate manner. He had the pale skin of a boy who rarely worked outdoors, hair the color of late summer wheat, and eyes that seemed to hold a gentle melancholy even before tragedy touched him. One evening, Nero passed by the training courtyard where young attendants were being drilled in court etiquette. There, among the others, stood Sporus's expression distant, his gestures precise yet unforced. Nero stopped, watching him longer than was proper. Later that night, at a private feast, he spoke of the boy's resemblance to Poppaea. The guests laughed politely, assuming it was a passing remark. But the emperor's tone was not casualty, carried that dangerous undercurrent of fixation that everyone in Rome had learned to fear. Over the next weeks, Nero had Sporus brought to his private wing more and more often. At first, it was to serve wine, to recite poetry, to assist with minor ceremonial duties. But the emperor began to study him in the way one might study marble before carving a statue. The resemblance to Poppaea was not exact yet in Nero's eyes. It was enough. And if it was not enough, then it could be altered. In whispered conferences with his personal physicians, he spoke of possibilities that made even hardened men uneasy. They argued it was dangerous, unnatural, an affront to Roman dignity. But Nero was not a man who accepted limits. The palace once again became a theater, this time with preparations happening behind velvet curtains and bolted doors. Sporus, unaware of the full horror ahead, felt the air shift around him, as if unseen hands were already beginning to shape his fate. The summer heat of Rome clung to the marble halls like a suffocating veil. Outside, the streets roared with merchants' cries and clattering wagon wheels, but inside the Palatine Palace, the air was heavy and still. Nero had retreated further into his private wing, away from Senate business, away from petitioners, away from reality. His days were now a strange, unbroken blur of music rehearsals, lavish banquets that ended in sudden silence, and long periods where he would simply sit in Poppaea's old chamber, staring at her last worn veil. It was during one of these half-waking reveries that he first noticed the boy. Sporus was not meant to be noticed. Barely 17, perhaps 18, he moved quietly in the background of the palace staff, carrying scrolls from one office to another, arranging flowers for the household shrines, tending to the caged songbirds that Poppaea had once adored. He had an unassuming grace, the sort that drew no attention until the eye lingered, and then refused to let go. That day, Nero watched him across the courtyard. The boy was kneeling beside a fountain, coaxing a frightened bird from a tangled reed. The way the sunlight fell across his face made the emperor's breath catch. Something in the slope of his cheekbones, the curve of his jaw for a flickering second, Nero thought he was seeing her again. Poppaea, alive, just beyond reach. The bird fluttered free. Sporus looked up. Their eyes met. Nero stood abruptly, the scrape of his gilded chair echoing through the courtyard. "Who is that?" he demanded of the steward at his side. The steward hesitated. "A servant, my lord. Sporus, the scribe's apprentice." Nero's gaze did not leave the boy. "Bring him to me." That evening, Sporus was led into the emperor's private chamber. It was dim, lit by a dozen oil lamps, their light softened by thin silk screens. Musicians had been dismissed. Only the faint trickle of water from an indoor fountain could be heard. Nero reclined on a couch, watching him. "You have her eyes," he murmured. Sporus bowed low, unsure whether to speak. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. "You will stay here," Nero said at last. "You will be my companion." His tone made the word feel both like an invitation and a command. From that moment, Sporus's life ceased to be his own. At first, Sporus assumed the emperor's interest was fleeting, a passing fancy, perhaps soon to be forgotten. But days stretched into weeks, and the attention grew stranger. Nero would have him dressed in Poppaea's old gowns, just to see the likeness. He would tilt Sporus's chin this way and that, as if memorizing angles. He began to speak of dreams where Poppaea stood beside him again, smiling, warm, alive. It was in the third week that Sporus overheard the plan. Two physicians, summoned to the private study, whispered in nervous Latin. "It can be done," one said, "though the risks are extreme." "Extreme or not," Nero replied sharply, "you will do it. I will not lose her again." Sporus's blood ran cold. He knew what they were discussing. The palace servants spoke in hushed tones of such things, the cutting away of manhood, the reshaping of flesh. No one survived it willingly, and yet here it was, being arranged as casually as a banquet menu. The chamber was prepared in secret, far from the palace's public wings. Heavy drapes sealed the windows. Tables were covered in bronze instruments, their edges glinting under lamplight. Clay jars of oil and wine stood ready for cleaning wounds, for numbing pain. Sporus was given a draught to drink, bitter and burning as it slid down his throat. His limbs grew heavy, the walls swaying around him. Shadows leaned in masked faces, murmuring prayers to Aesculapius, the god of healing. The pain came in waves, crashing, receding, crashing again. His cries were muffled by cloth. The smell of iron and blood filled the air. At some point, his mind fled entirely, retreating into a cold, endless darkness. When he woke, he could not move. Days bled into nights. Fever gripped him. The wound throbbed like a second heartbeat. Servants tended to him, constantly changing bandages, spooning broth into his mouth, wiping sweat from his brow. Some could not meet his eyes. Nero visited often. Sometimes he would simply sit at Sporus's bedside, humming the same lullaby he had once sung to Poppaea. Other times he would speak softly of the future, the dresses he would have made, the jewels he would see upon Sporus's neck, the public adoration they would share. In those moments, Sporus understood the truth. To Nero, he was no longer Sporus. He was an empty vessel into which Poppaea's ghost had been poured. When Sporus could walk again, the training began. Tutors were brought in, women from the court who had known Poppaea well. They taught him how she had moved, how she had spoken, the delicate cadence of her laughter. They corrected his posture, the angle of his hand when lifting a wine cup, the precise tilt of his head when acknowledging a senator's greeting. The gowns came next, silks from Alexandria sewn with gold thread. Perfumes Poppaea had favored jasmine and myrrh. Even her old slippers kept in a cedar chest were pressed into service. Each transformation was met with Nero's rapturous approval. "Perfect," he would say, his eyes shining. "She lives again." Outside the emperor's private wing, the palace buzzed with quiet horror. Senators avoided the topic entirely, pretending not to notice the youth who now walked at Nero's side, dressed as an empress. Servants traded whispered stories in the kitchens, careful not to speak too loudly in case the walls had ears. Some pitied Sporus. Others envied the jewels and silks. Most simply feared what it meant that the emperor's power had grown so absolute he could remake a person entirely, body and soul, on a whim. Sporus learned quickly that survival meant silence. He smiled when expected, laughed when required, and hid his true thoughts behind a mask as flawless as the one Nero had given him. The transformation was complete. Sporus was no longer a servant, nor entirely a man, nor wholly himself. He was Poppaea Sabina, returned from the dead, or at least the version of her that existed in the fevered dreams of an emperor who could not let go. And soon, Nero would decide to make the illusion permanent with a wedding. The days leading to the wedding were unlike anything Rome had seen before. Not because imperial weddings were rare, they were spectacles Rome had witnessed plenty of times, but because of who was getting married. The Senate knew. The palace staff whispered it in kitchens and marble corridors. Every noblewoman in Rome had heard the gossip from her hairdresser, who had heard it from a laundress, who had heard it from a stable boy. The Emperor Nero was about to marry a boy. But not just any boy Sporus. The young man Nero had reshaped, trained, and molded into the image of his late wife, Poppaea Sabina. In the heart of the Palatine Hill, The palace was transformed into a living jewel box. Artisans worked through the nights, torchlight flickering over hands that polished marble floors until they gleamed like still water. Gold leaf was applied to door frames, the fountains were scented with rose water, and the air was heavy with the perfume of imported lilies from Alexandria. Tailors from the imperial workshop stitched silk robes so delicate they could be drawn through a ring. Gold threads caught in the lamplight like strands of sunlight. Jewelers fashioned a crown for Sporus, a circlet of laurel leaves set with emeralds, the same crown Poppaea had worn at her own wedding to Nero. It was not an imitation. It was the same piece. And in the imperial stables, the purest white horses were brushed until their coats shone, harnesses polished, hooves oiled. In the marketplaces of the Suburra, wine merchants poured samples for customers, eager to speculate on the bizarre event. "They say he's had the boy dressed in Poppaea's gowns," one said, refilling a cup. "Not just dressed," another whispered, glancing around for eavesdroppers. "They say he's been trained to walk like her, to speak like her, to smile in the same way." "Blasphemy," an old matron muttered. "But I will still watch the procession." For Rome's citizens, curiosity outweighed morality. The morning of the wedding dawned clear, the sky a deep Roman blue. The streets along the ceremonial route were swept clean. Fresh garlands were hung between buildings, and incense burners were lit, their smoke curling lazily into the air. Inside the palace, Sporus stood in the bridal chamber. He wore a stola of shimmering gold silk, embroidered with winding vines and tiny amethysts. A translucent veil cascaded over his shoulders, pinned with diamond clasps. His skin had been dusted with crushed pearl powder until it glowed in the lamplight. His lips were tinted with pomegranate, his eyes lined with kohl. He was beautiful. Beautiful in the way Poppaea had been, and that was exactly the point. Nero entered the room, wearing robes of imperial purple and a crown of gold leaves. His eyes roamed over Sporus with pride, satisfaction, and something darker. "You are perfect," Nero murmured, lifting the veil slightly to study his face. "They will see her again. They will remember." Sporus did not answer. He lowered his gaze, just as he had been taught. The palace gates opened, and the imperial wedding procession began. Musicians led the way, lyre players, flautists, and trumpeters, whose notes echoed off the stone walls of the city. Behind them came the priests of Venus, scattering petals in the street. Nero and Sporus followed in a gilded chariot, drawn by the white horses. The crowd erupted not in cheers exactly, but in a mix of awe, disbelief, and morbid fascination. "It's her! Look, it's Poppaea returned!" "No, look closer. It's him, the boy." Then the rumors are true. Children craned their necks to see. Women clutched at their friends' arms. Men shook their heads but could not look away. In the forum, a great platform had been built, draped with red and gold banners. The Senate was gathered, dressed in pure white togas, the purple borders marking their rank. The Vestal virgins stood to one side, their faces unreadable. The Pontifex Maximus began the rites, chanting the traditional invocations to the gods. Nero took Sporus's hand. The boy's fingers were cold beneath the layers of gold rings. "Do you, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, take this spouse to be bound in the eyes of the gods?" "I do." "And do you, Sporus, take this man as your husband?" There was a pause. "I do," Sporus said, his voice soft, perfectly modulated, exactly as Poppaea's had once been. The marriage contract was signed and sealed. Nero lifted Sporus's veil, kissed him before the crowd, and the forum roared not with joy, but with the shock of witnessing something no one in Rome's long history had ever seen. That night, the palace blazed with lamplight. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, honeyed dormice, and exotic fruits from the edges of the empire. Musicians played, dancers spun, and jugglers tossed flaming torches. Sporus sat beside Nero at the head table, smiling when spoken to, sipping watered wine, answering in the soft, measured tones he had been trained to use. But beneath the table, his hands were clenched in his lap, nails digging into his palms. Every time Nero laughed, he turned to Sporus as if expecting him to laugh too. Every time a toast was raised, Nero's arm went protectively around his new bride. The message was clear. This was no joke, no passing amusement. This was the Empress of Rome. In the days and weeks that followed, Sporus was treated publicly as Nero's wife. He attended games at the Colosseum at Nero's side, waving to the crowds. He rode in the imperial carriage during processions, always veiled, always radiant. He received foreign envoys who bowed and presented gifts as if to an actual empress. He signed ceremonial decrees with a jeweled stylus. But behind closed doors, the illusion weighed on him like a stone. Every glance in the mirror was a reminder of what he had lost, not just his body, but his name, his self, his life. Yet, he survived. In the dangerous, glittering world of the Roman court, survival was everything. The summer of AD 68 burned hotter than any before. Rome was no longer a city under Nero's spell. Bread was scarce, whispers of rebellion no longer hushed themselves when footsteps passed, and the Praetorian Guard, the Emperor's own protectors, looked at him with a calculating stillness that was new and dangerous. For years, Nero had convinced himself that Rome loved him as he loved Rome, fiercely, possessively, eternally. He had sung to her, raced his chariots for her amusement, rebuilt her after the Great Fire, and adorned her with marble and gold. But the truth was harder than marble and colder than gold. Rome's patience had run out. In the provinces, governors and generals began to smell opportunity. Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul raised a banner of rebellion. Servius Sulpicius Galba in Hispania declared himself Legatus Senatus Populique Romani, a man loyal not to Nero, but to the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate itself began to murmur dangerous, deadly murmurings about restoring dignity to the empire. For Sporus, these rumblings felt distant at first. He still played his part as Empress Poppaea, walking at Nero's side, smiling for the public, gliding in silk and gold. But inside the palace walls, he saw the signs. Guards replaced without explanation, supply lines tightened, familiar faces vanishing from court. And Nero, once a man of relentless appetites, had begun to eat little and sleep less. One night, as they dined in the flickering light of bronze oil lamps, Nero spoke in a low, almost dreamy voice. "They want to take me from Rome, Sporus," he said, turning his cup slowly in his hand. "They forget what I have given them." Sporus held his gaze, unsure whether to comfort him or remain silent. Comfort could be dangerous. Anything that sounded like pity was an insult. But silence could also be dangerous, taken as defiance. "You are Rome, my lord," Sporus finally said, the words tasting like ash. Nero smiled faintly. "Yes, I am." When the tension in Rome became unbearable, Nero left for Greece, dragging his court and Sporus across the sea. There, among the marble theaters and sunlit shores, he sought the applause he still believed was his birthright. He performed in contests, sang in the great theaters of Corinth and Athens, and even announced grand plans to dig a canal across the isthmus. Greek elites, eager not to anger Rome, applauded with well-rehearsed enthusiasm. But behind their eyes was calculation, not devotion. Sporus traveled everywhere with him, dressed in flowing Greek robes and golden headpieces, playing the role of a supportive empress. Yet in the quiet moments when Nero's voice was hoarse from singing, when his feet were sore from hours on the stage, Sporus saw the cracks deepen. Nero's hands sometimes trembled as he poured wine. He stared into the distance as if trying to find something just out of reach. By the time Nero returned to Italy, rebellion was no longer a shadow. It was a storm at the gates. The Senate declared him a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him, swayed by promises from Galba. Even his freedmen, the men who had been his most loyal servants, were slipping away. Nero retreated to his villa outside Rome with only a handful of attendants. Sporus was among them, still bound to him by fear, habit, and a strange, tangled thread of loyalty. On the night of June 8th, AD 68, a messenger arrived with the final blow. The Senate had decreed his execution in the ancient style, stripped naked, head fastened in a wooden fork, beaten to death with rods. The punishment for a slave who had betrayed his master. For the first time in his life, Nero seemed truly afraid. "What an artist the world is losing," he whispered. But there was no audience left to applaud. In the early hours before dawn, as the sound of approaching riders echoed in the distance, Nero took up a dagger. His hands shook violently. He looked at Sporus. "Do it for me," Nero said. Sporus froze. He could not be the one to end him. After a long silence, Nero forced the blade against his throat himself, and with the help of a loyal secretary, Epaphroditos, he drove it home. The life of Rome's last Julio-Claudian emperor ended not with a roar, but with a choked gasp. Sporus stood in the cold stillness after dawn, creeping through the shutters. He had been made to live as another man's dead wife, forced into silks and jewels, praised and paraded as an illusion. And now the man who had remade him was gone. But freedom did not come with Nero's death. Instead, Sporus became a prize passed between powerful men. Otho, a former friend of Nero and now a rising figure in the chaos, claimed him first perhaps out of genuine affection, perhaps to keep alive a piece of the old emperor's myth. But Otho's rule was brief, and Vitellius soon took the purple. Vitellius saw in Sporus not a person, but an opportunity for cruelty. At one banquet in the middle of a drunken feast, he announced a public spectacle. Sporus would be dressed as a bride once more, but this time for a grotesque reenactment of the myth of Proserpina, the goddess dragged to the underworld. Before the crowd, he would be violated, humiliated, and mocked, a living plaything for the mob. When Sporus heard of Vitellius's plan, he did not rage, he did not plead, he simply withdrew into his chambers, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. He sat before a small bronze mirror, the same one he had used for years to perfect the tilt of his head, the softness of his smile, the exact illusion of Poppaea. In that reflection, he no longer saw her. He saw only himself, what was left of him, and the knowledge that the last thing he controlled was the manner of his own end. That night, Sporus took his own life. Some say it was poison, others that he opened his veins. No one knows for certain, because in the morning the palace servants found only stillness. History remembers Nero's madness, Poppaea's beauty, and the cruelty of Rome's elite. Sporus is remembered only as a footnote, the boy who became an empress. But in the quiet truth beneath the marble and myth, he was a human being caught in the machinery of power, reshaped, used, discarded. Rome moved on, as she always did. The Senate argued over the next emperor. Crowds gathered in the arena. Merchants opened their stalls at dawn. The empire churned forward, indifferent to the lives it crushed beneath its sandals. And somewhere in the dust of history, the story of Sporus remains a reminder that in the shadow of great power, even the most glittering life can be nothing more than a gilded cage.